Thanks, Sheila, for that beautiful word. Appreciate it. Read to us this morning out of the book of Isaiah. And we read from the second chapter. This is what Isaiah, son of Amoz, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains. It will be exalted above the hills, and all nations will stream to it. Many peoples will come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his way so that we may walk in his paths." The law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between the nations and will settle disputes for many peoples. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for a war anymore. Come, descendants of Jacob, let us walk in the light of the Lord. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. We don't really know much about him, but I have a feeling that despite his name, Isaiah never intended to be a prophet per se. At least not one of those fiery trumpets of God whose messages often put them at odds with almost everybody else. It wasn't what he had in mind for his life. I can understand that. For all of my life, I have had people tell me in a burst of what they think is Smucker's-like original thinking that with a name like Chapel Temple, I had to be good. I had no choice but to become a preacher. Some folks have accused me over the years of actually making up my name as a kind of a stage name for preaching. Father Drew, my Catholic priest friend down the street, St. Lawrence, stood in this pulpit on Monday and he commented on my name at the interfaith service. I've explained it many times over. Chapel is simply a family name. My grandmother was a Chapel, just like the folks who started the little Washington County town of Chapel Hill. That's our family's town. And my dad was a Temple, or more precisely, he was a Temples, for originally our surname was in the plural until it became too confusing when there were more than one of us. So I ended up with this kind of odd-sounding moniker. It caused me to ask my mother one day if she'd ever actually sounded this out before she wrote it down on the birth certificate. But I can tell you, despite how it sounds, growing up, being a minister was not what I ever thought I would do. I kind of suspect it wasn't Isaiah's first choice either, despite his name, because his name means quite literally Yah, or the salvation of the Lord, or the Lord saves. Now we're pretty sure that he lived in Jerusalem and that he was married with children. Clearly he was a bit of a literary genius with a clear vision of the future, so much so that scholars have concluded that there must have been more than one man writing under that name. I don't agree with their textual arguments, by the way, but if there was, in fact, a second Isaiah and maybe even a third Isaiah, I say bring them on. We can use all the Isaiahs we can possibly get, right? But curiously enough, the rabbi suggested that his father Amoz, who's mentioned here, was the brother of one of the kings of Judah, King Amaziah. That would have made Isaiah Uzziah's cousin, thus a member of the royal family. And if so, Isaiah would have had a very close-up view indeed of all the failures and foibles of those four kings of Judah who are listed here, who reigned during his time. Uzziah, Jotham's son Ahaz, Ahaz's son Hezekiah, whose efforts to fortify Jerusalem included digging a tunnel through bedrock more than 100 feet deep, 1/3 of a mile long, to bring in water in case of a siege. Some of you have been in that tunnel. A defensive move that prevented the outright capture of Jerusalem in 701 by the Assyrians. But on the whole, what happened in those years was a bit of a mixed story. 2 Chronicles 26 tells us, for instance, that though Uzziah started off right with the Lord, that after he became powerful, his pride led to his downfall. One day, he tried to assume for himself the right of offering sacrifices in the temple rather than the priest doing that. They confronted him, and Uzziah went into a rage against them until, that is, the Lord struck him with leprosy, a separating disease that he had for the rest of his life until he died several years later. And in that fabled year that King Uzziah died, 740 BC, those opening words of Isaiah 6 tell us that the prophet received a vision from the Lord, high and exalted, seated on a throne, and he heard the voice of God saying, "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" And upon hearing those words, Isaiah answered simply, "Here am I, send me." And we ought to note just in passing that that really was quite a remarkable response. Micah had already tried to speak for God and had been smitten on the cheek by those who opposed him. Amos likewise was sent and had been reviled. But Isaiah said yes to his heavenly vision anyway, and thus began a spiritual work of God both in and through him that was to take him to the very edges of the incarnation, still some 7 centuries ahead. Now that's why we've chosen to spend our Advent season wandering through some of what old Isaiah had to say, and the very best understanding of what the word prophet means, not so much foretelling as forthtelling. Nabi is the Hebrew word, messenger, prophetes, to speak for someone in the Greek. Isaiah lived up to his name, the Lord saves. It was Isaiah, for instance, who first told us about a virgin who would conceive and bear a child who should be called Emmanuel, our God with us. It was Isaiah who penned those words of promise that we sing every Christmas season, "For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulders." It was Isaiah who suggested that one day peace will reign upon this earth because of that child who becomes the Prince of Peace. In the words of that old Christmas carol, Isaiah 'twas foretold it. The rose I have in mind, and that was the rose of Sharon. It's no wonder that the New Testament writers quote Isaiah more than any other Old Testament book. It's earned the nickname of the fifth gospel for that reason. See, read through the first chapter of this book and you'll discover that just as the prophets had warned, things were not going well in Jerusalem and in Judah. Already Assyria had begun to rise in the northeast. In 721 BC, they descended upon the northern kingdom of Israel like a storm, conquering it, hauling off much of the population to parts unknown from which most of them never returned, becoming those fabled lost 10 tribes of Israel. So despite their prolonged period of prosperity, hear that, despite their prolonged period of prosperity, those in Judah with eyes to see knew that it was coming to an end. 20 years after the fall of Israel, Samaria in the north, during the time of Hezekiah, the Assyrians came back to try and conquer Judah as well. They didn't succeed thanks to what Hezekiah had done, but they came very close. Yet as scary as the Assyrians were, and later on, the even more disturbingly dramatic, frightening Babylonians, the real enemy of Judah was not an external foe. It was an internal one. Like their cousins in the north, the people of Isaiah's time were a rebellious nation. The ox knows its master. The donkey knows its owner's manager, Isaiah said. But Israel does not know me. My people do not understand. They were a sinful people. A people whose guilt was great, a brood of evildoers who he knew had spurned the Holy One of Israel, turned their backs upon him. They weren't just acting like Sodom and Gomorrah, they were those sinful cities. Because even worse, their worship seem to make God gag. I hate with all my being, God says. Chapter 1, verse 14. I hate with all my being all of your feasts and all your appointed festivals, your potlucks and your evenings of praise, because none of it mattered, you see, in how the people of Isaiah's time were acting. They took bribes, they perverted justice, they practiced economic inequities. They did not defend the cause of the fatherless. The widows couldn't even get their day in court. Despite their words, the people of Judah had stopped trusting in God. They were trusting in themselves completely. In short, the opening chapter of Isaiah presents us with a very disturbing and discomforting portrait of the people of Isaiah's day. But let's be clear, dear friends. This could be a picture of you and me this morning as well, couldn't it? Of our culture, our society with all of its own social and economic injustices, even of our churches, which sometimes put on quite a show, wrongly assuming that God is watching and is interested or even impressed. The good news, however, is that this is fortunately a before picture. Because the prophet saw that on the horizon of history was an event that was to change everything, not just for Isaiah's people, but for you and me too. If chapter 1 ends on a discouraging note, look at how chapter 2 begins. In the last days. In the last days. That was a Hebrew method of designating human history, which was to call it simply the days. The word used here, Baharit, is a way of pointing us to the hindmost, to the farthermost of those days. That is to say, the time that is yet to be. There's even a little play on words here in the Hebrew writing, facing off that term Baharit with the word Bereshith, which is the beginning of Genesis 1, in the Bereshith, in the beginning. So it will come to pass, Isaiah said, in the last days, that the mountain, the har of the house, the bet of the Lord, will be established or made permanent as the chief, the head, the rosh of all the mountains, and will be raised up and exalted, lifted above all the other hills, in order that all nations may flow towards it. This is a little odd language, really. There's a topographical revision going on here. Even the Mount of Olives was higher than Mount Zion. There's also a lovely anti-gravitational kind of anomaly here. A human river flowing uphill to worship God? All the nations, the Goyim, the Gentiles will stream to it, and many peoples will say, come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us. And the word for teach means to shoot something like an archer would, straight, piercing. May teach us concerning his way, that we may walk in his paths. For the law, the Torah, will go forth from Zion, and the word, the debar, the theme, the speech of the Lord from Jerusalem. In turn, God will judge or govern between the nations and render decisions for many peoples, with the result that they will hammer, crush, break, cut up their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks, more specifically masmara. Those are pruning knives, the kind that you would use to cut back vines in order to increase their power to produce fruit. Nation will not lift up sword against nation. As if from a second Sinai, God's teaching will go forth from Mount Zion, usher in a new reign of universal peace. Never again will they learn war. Isn't it instructive that Isaiah reminds us war is not something which is innate in us? You have to be taught how to fight. It's a skill that requires training. But in the after picture of what is yet to come, to quote an old song, we ain't gonna study war no more, are we? So what does all this mean? Is this just another utopian vision of a world that none of us will actually ever see? I don't think so. I think this is rather a promise of the kind of life we can begin to have right now. No matter what kind of chaos or confusion that there may be in our lives. This is a pathway forward even when the way seems blocked, for God is bigger than you think he is. Robert Alter, a great Jewish scholar, translator and interpreter of these words, has put it this way: there is an imaginative boldness, perhaps rather the courage of desperation in this vision, because Isaiah articulated it at a historical moment of continual warfare among imperial powers when the land of Israel itself was threatened by destruction. Edward Young, perhaps the prince of the evangelical scholars who spent decades studying these texts, similarly suggests here that Isaiah is no mere dreamer presenting a vision of utopia which would be impossible to be realized. Rather, Young says, he speaks with the certainty of one who has received a message from God, who is his true prophet. It shall be, he declares, with blessed dogmatism, for the promises of God are sure of fulfillment. If anything is certain, it is that Zion will one day be exalted, for God has so decreed and made his decree known to the prophet. And in that regard, what Isaiah wants to show us is more of God and more of ourselves than we've ever seen before. He wants us to know that into our troubled world, God has spoken to us from the borders of another world. That's the whole point of the incarnation that we soon celebrate. That's the focus of Advent as we wait for the return of the one who will make all things right. But in the meantime, God wants us to know what it is to be saved. He wants to lead us into a life that outlasts our earthly expiration date. So what do we have to do? Here's the really great news. Nothing. Nothing. Nothing but accept that God does it all. He's involved in everything that brings us from death in sin to life and glory. In the words of J.I. Packer, sinners do not save themselves in any sense at all. All we have to do is come. But when you come, might I suggest you bring along your swords and your spears and let God beat them into plowshares and pruning hooks. The world's had enough war, don't you think? One estimate says in the last 5,000 years of recorded human history, only 290 of them, 290 out of 5,000 years were marked by peace, or rather by the absence of any known warfare. 170 million people were killed in just the last century alone as a result of war. World War II eliminated some 2% of the world's population, 2/3 of whom were non-combatants. But even just the preparations for war rob whole societies of something greater, because every warship, every fighter jet, every nuclear weapon equates to homeless folks sleeping on streets, hungry families that are seeking help from food banks, schools not being built, roads not being repaired, hospitals not expanding, lives not being lived in the abundance that Jesus came to offer us. That's why we have to recommit ourselves to becoming people who practice peace whenever and wherever we can. Now, I am not a contestant for Miss America. I do not believe world peace will just come around because we say it. Our hearts are too bent inward. But with God, all things really are possible. Even those things which the world has long since declared to be impossible. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German theologian and martyr to the Nazis, said, "Peace must be dared. It can never be safe. Peace is the opposite of security. But battles are won not with weapons, but with God. They are won where the way leads to the cross." Let me be really clear. This is not a call for absolute pacifism this morning. Sometimes we have no choice. The strong must defend the weak. Nations must defend those who live within them. Many years ago when I was in college, I became a pacifist. And a friend of mine said in passing something one day that just stunned me, it floored me. He said he had observed that over the 3 years he had known me, I had gone from being really hepped on Jesus and excited about Christian faith to becoming really hepped on pacifism. He didn't mean it in any way, just an observation. I realized, have I done that? Have I substituted pacifism for Jesus? I don't want to be an absolute anything, but an absolute child of God, forgiven by his grace. But this is an alternative vision for the future that the culture around us knows very little about. This is a vision that will yet be, my dear friends. And so our job this morning is not just to embrace this vision, but to begin to put it into practice in our own lives. To be people of peace, not war, not arguments, not debates. People of peace. Faced with the prospect of their impending destruction, the kings of Israel tried to play off one power against other powers, Egypt against the Assyrians, and then Egypt against the Babylonians, and then the Babylonians against Egypt. They said they believed in God, but what they actually trusted was themselves. If that sounds a wee bit familiar to you this morning, listen again to this word from the ancient prophet. Don't depend on yourself. Don't depend on anybody else completely. Put your trust in the Lord. You see, no matter what your name may be or what others call you, this much I know from Isaiah: the Lord saves. Come surrender your swords. Let God make them into plowshares. You'll be surprised just how good peace can really feel. Amen.